Well, hello everyone, and welcome. We'll get started with our with today's webinar. We will do a little more formal introductions, but I'm Eva Weens, and I'll be doing the introduction here of our slide deck. Joining me today is Mitch Kelsey, who is driving the deck. So, Mitch, if you're ready to get started, we can get started looking at this. Before we get started, I just wanted to kind of give everybody a little bit of background on how this came about. The idea was for us to review working from home situation from a security perspective. At first, we were focusing specifically in the area where I live, so specifically in Manitoba, Saskatchewan. But we've had such great uptake from the other regions that we expanded it beyond Manitoba, Saskatchewan into Alberta and Ontario. And this is a prairie sort of view, a prairie's perspective. And as you can see, in the agenda, we have a bullet specifically for that. But it applies everywhere as we start talking about what it means to, to run an SMB, to secure your small or medium business in Canada during this really, difficult time for everyone. So what we're doing, I'll go through a little housekeeping notes. We'll do introductions. Mitch and I will do. Oh, sorry. Can you go back? I'm just going to go through the agenda. Introductions. We'll talk about the shifting edge, the new security normal, what changed and what remains the same. Mitch will flip it back to me, and I'll talk about security in the prairies and where organizations are prioritizing and what might be next. We also had a great list of questions that came from your when you signed up. So we have those questions, and we're open to receive more questions as well through the chat. Let's jump into housekeeping, and we'll cover that. So we are already recording this presentation, so just so you're aware. So we'll be available later. Hopefully we don't get any drop-offs right after I say we're recording the presentation, and we would love to have you participate throughout and listen, specifically in the Q&A box that we have through WebEx on the right. And we'll be also conducting a live poll via WebEx, so the more participation we have on the live, the better, as we're trying to understand where you're coming from. So, and then following the presentation, if you have any additional questions, to CDW account manager, although Mitch and I have also shared our email addresses in the slides coming up, and feel free to send us direct emails as well. So without further ado, let's do some introductions here. Mitch, if you can go forward. So basically, I'll give you some background on who CDW is. We are a growing company that has grown a lot through its own right, but also through a lot of acquisitions. And you see the acquisition that I really want to talk about, and the reason I even put this slide up is the 2019 acquisition of Scalar. It really changed how CDW was shaped. That's where I came from. That's where Mitch came from, and really changed how CDW sees the Canadian market from a security perspective, and how it can approach the Canadian market from that perspective. So what we are talking about now is a lot more services, a lot of managed services and professional services that were not previously part of the CDW portfolio are now part of it. So that's what that acquisition means, and that's what it means in that really it covers Canada from coast to coast. So if we go to the next slide, I can show you a little bit of what we mean by the expansion. CDW is ranked in the 2024 to 500 as a company. 2020, the number 3 in the 500 rank over a T services industry. 18 billion in sales, 250,000 customers internationally, 9,900 coworkers. Coming from a 350 co-worker company that was Scalar into this bigger story gives us so much more to talk about, and so much more to expand from a market perspective, but also from a technology perspective and a knowledge perspective. So really happy to be part of this family and be able to bring all kinds of different services to you. This is one of those great graphics to talk about from a CDW perspective and from a Scalar perspective. CDW's changing model with the Scalar acquisition was to move from a over the phone remote selling right out of that one Etobicoke location that you see on the bottom right there, to covering the whole country from a local perspective. So now, not only do we have still the great sales force over the phone and via the website, but also we have the local presence to help with professional services, to help with sales, to help with product selection, to help with identifying your security needs and beyond security onto uh, other areas such as a hybrid IT or cloud as well. So a breadth of IT services available way beyond the initial portfolio that CDW had. So 900 coworkers, 9 offices, 900 ITS 290 ITS coworkers, and that's what we're talking about is the services and managed services side, and 1.2 billion plus in revenue. So we'll skip through this introductory stuff. I think that this will give you a good background and get talking about us. So my name's Eva Weens. I manage our security architecture team. So what does that mean at the new world of CDW? It means that we work with clients to help them identify the right security solutions to help them achieve security or compliance goals. We're looking specifically at what, from a vendor agnostic perspective, how can we help your organization solve security problems? We obviously have strong partners. We deal with, name a major security partner, and we're likely have sold and in some cases are the biggest partner for that. So our approach is really to help clients find what's best for them, considering the market, considering what we can help with, and considering how we can implement people, process, and technology to fit within the environment. So in all those areas, that's what my team does. I'm based out of Winnipeg. I manage our national team. I've been in the security industry for 15 years. Started in the professional services side of the house and the technical and risk compliance. I've managed security operation centers and implemented a lot of technical solutions. So I've been around for a while. Now I get to lead a really strong team with really smart people. My hobbies include traveling, not so much lately, but cooking and spending time with my 2 daughters is some of the things that I do. There's my email, so you can contact me. And now I'm going to introduce you to Mitch. Mitch, if you want to do your own introduction and take it from here, that'd be fantastic.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Mitch Kelsey. I'm a cybersecurity advisor here with CDW. As Ivo mentioned, both of us came with the Scalar acquisition. I represent a risk advisory services practice in Western Canada. So that covers our offensive security capabilities, so penetration testing, governance, risk and compliance consulting, and vulnerability management. Prior to joining Scalar, I was a risk advisory services consultant myself. So that's kind of where my background lies. And prior to that, I came from a strategic security background. So looking at cybersecurity as a facet of a larger security conversation within organizations, that generally is how I think about these sort of conversations. So when we have topics like this about how things are changing, with environmental conditions and some of the global issues that are occurring today, it's something I'm really interested in. Outside of talking about cybersecurity, and when we have the ability to do so, you can find me playing soccer on my team, working in the kitchen at home, or spending time with my family, my wife, my 2 little boys, and my bulldog, Hank. And as Ivo mentioned, both of our email addresses are here. On top of reaching out to your account manager, if you have any specific questions about this or want to continue the conversation, please feel free to reach out to one of the 2 of us. Let's talk about what this shifting edge looks like and what the new security normal is, both in the short term and some of the longer term trends and forces that we're all grappling with right now. So for those of you who are not aware, CDW has been now, Scalar had prior, and now CDW continues the tradition of putting a Canadian-focused annual security study out in the market. And what I find particularly interesting about this, compared to some of the others that you may see, is we're seeing local information about the organizations that we work with that are in your own neighborhood. And there's some interesting statistics that came up from this just prior to some of the lockdown requirements that happened with COVID-19. And I think it's going to be really representative of some of the things that are quite similar to what had occurred last year and where some of those major changes have been with the changes in requirements. So to start, one of the areas that we see increasing prevalence is this is the second year in a row that 100% of the respondents to the survey had experienced some type of cyber attack. So prior to that, that number was creeping up towards 100%, but now this is the new normal, that every organization that we work with is experiencing some sort of malicious activity. almost 82% of those respondents had mentioned that one of these incidents had occurred due to the poor security hygiene of a third-party partner. And that's going to span a number of different ways that happens, and we're going to get into some of the issues that come up with that. But being able to understand your own supply chain, particularly now where we've all had to make changes and better understand our environment from a digital perspective, is an important consideration. Another area of note that I think is going to be increasingly important now is the prevalence and increasing frequency and dangerousness of ransomware attacks. And all of you will be well aware of hearing stories or experiencing ransomware in your own environments. But one of the changes that's been happening as of late is the areas where organizations are being most significantly affected are ones where they have a really diverse asset set. So organizations that have adopted a partially or fully bring your own device policy, or have IoT devices that may not have the same security coverage that your typical corporate endpoints would. On the security strategy and effectiveness side, we've noticed some interesting data points here as well. And I think this translates well into this conversation in terms of organizations that have been most quickly and effectively able to weather this storm as it came to changes in their environment. So organizations that have integrated their cyber risk and their enterprise risk strategies, we've noted that although they've been experiencing attacks with the same frequency that other organizations, they have not been as successful. So actual exfiltration of data or intrusion into the environment is a lot less likely when organizations have taken this as an organizational approach, as opposed to it being siloed with the IT security department. Another area that's specifically relevant to the conversation today is that although cloud-based deployment models are becoming more of a priority, and we've seen this with organizations needing to procure a lot of resources to allow users to work from home, organizations still struggle to effectively protect those environments compared to the controls that they had in place with traditional on-prem infrastructure. And so this is the point where we were looking to get some participation from you, because we really want to hear how this relates to your own experiences and the experiences of those that you work with. So Gartner, right at the beginning of the pandemic, released some information about the likelihood of organizations making these changes to their environment more permanent. So Gartner's HR survey reveals that many organizations have encouraged their employees to work from home. I know that's the case with our organization, and I know it's the case with a lot of the customers that I talk to. But the likelihood is that this will be either permanent, or at least a larger proportion of the time that many employees are going to be spending in the future. I know we work with organizations in a number of industries where it just wasn't a possibility in the past, whether it was a regulatory issue, whether it was just a culture issue. And some of these organizations have actually seen some significant benefits of allowing their users to work from home, whether it's just the savings and in terms of time that people are not spending commuting, and the benefits that come from that. Whether it's just flexibility and allowing more work. There's a lot of benefits that come from this, but it's certainly something that organizations are going to have to grapple with as these changes continue to progress. So just for clarification, there should be a poll tab just above where the Q&A section is. So please feel free to fill that out, and we're going to go through those details at the end of the time period.
Yeah, we're really curious to see how you feel, in your local area, and how you feel your organization more specifically will be, if this really reflects what's happening in your environment, right? I think these American large organization numbers are useful to some extent, but I'm curious to how your market and how you're doing locally, how you feel your organization will go back. We've heard so many stories, right, Mitch, of organizations that are saying we're not going back till the end of the year. I don't foresee us going back to 25%. And other organizations that say, you know what, we've been we're deemed essential and we're going in, and there's about 50% in the office, and we just don't have water coolers anymore, but we have still the same same commute and same security controls from a physical security perspective that we get to enjoy within our organization. It'd be really curious to see how you guys are seeing, and we'll review that as it comes up. So thank you for participating. And sorry, Mitch.
I'll also be curious to see, because I would imagine that that the major changes this year that are being reflected in these studies are going to be a topic of conversation for the 2021 CDW security study, and I'm interested to see what we're able to see from the participants in that as well.
Yeah, it was really interesting because when we were going through, and I was helping our Theo and our marketing team to put together the report, it was really interesting to see, because it was looming at the time, right? We were at the RSA conference and we were going through the results, and people had already started to talk about this virus from China. So it was looming, but it was definitely didn't change the data for our report. So look forward to next year's report and how people have reacted, and we will be doing a lot of questions on that. And in the meantime, we get to review the data from IDC and Gartner on it as well. So.
So speaking of IDC, so easily understanding that the securing the new work from home infrastructure and services was an initial concern for many organizations, and it's something that a lot of the conversations that we had with organizations early on and still continuing were really focused on how do we address these new changes in our organization, along with some of the other areas that we touched on in terms of digital transformation, looking at opportunities for pivoting to cloud where that may have been a slightly longer term decision prior. So let's talk about some of those changes and areas that have remained constant. So just to reiterate what some of those findings were from the security study. So looking at what we were discussing previously, challenges around securing these new cloud services, looking at the effectiveness of ransomware in the environments, particularly when we're talking about assets that are not as protected as they were previously, looking at conversations related to that risk strategy and how not only is it integrated with the other risk conversations you're having, but also how do we bake resilience into those conversations? So when we're talking about ransomware, when we're talking about those quick pivot requirements for organizations that had to quickly move to a remote work model, what are the controls that can be put in place to help make sure that that process can be done as safely and consistently as possible? So what has remained constant? We've seen an uptick in social engineering attacks targeting COVID-19. It was more, I think, more of an issue up front, but really this is nothing new. This is the same type of tactic that threat actors use anytime there is a new event. You know, you've seen this before whenever there is a significant environmental disaster, that fraud related to charity work for those instances always pops up. So that is, although the topic is different, the motions associated with that are pretty much the same. We continue to see critical vulnerabilities released in common internet-facing services. So seen some significant ones related to Microsoft, a couple of these other vendors as well. And that is going to continue to be the case as users more heavily focus on these remote access solutions. And we're now in a new normal where there are massive caches of valid credentials that are available on the internet. So we're not only looking at attackers who are interested in finding flaws in your security perimeter, but we're also looking at them finding flaws in your identity management. So if an organization has leaked credentials because users have been reusing usernames and passwords in other places, that's increasingly the conversations we have when organizations get breached. It's one of the main ways that we find organizations are actually being exploited and targeted. a couple of weeks ago, there was an article that there was a newly available cache on GitHub that had 15 billion credentials, 5 billion of which were unique to that cache that are available for purchase. And from that set, it was an aggregation of 100,000 different data breaches. So we're now at a point that this is something that you have to be under the expectation that information will be available about you online, whether you like it or not. And there's differences that we need to take to approach that. Has anybody seen this graphic? I thought it was funny when, again, right at the beginning of the pandemic, that organizations that have been looking to make these decisions for a while, finally there was a justification for it, where maybe they didn't have the opportunity to move forward before, or it just was an organizational priority that COVID has really driven a lot of these conversations. Organizations have had to make significant network and infrastructure changes to make those services that your end users need to be able to do their jobs available when they're working in a different environment than that had been architected for them. One of the other considerations that I think is really important here, not only right now, but also as these changes happen, where we may move to a hybrid model where users may be going back to work, but they may have new accessibility to services than they didn't have before, just because as an organization, you've learned that there's some benefit to them being able to access things differently, or maybe you've had to change solutions to be able to meet this current demand that are going to make sense to keep permanent. So understanding how those behaviors of your users and your systems may have changed in your environment. So, your users are going to be accessing corporate resources differently than they did before, perhaps. The timing in terms of time of day that they're going to be using these resources and from what occasions is going to be different. I know in my case, if I have opportunities to spend some sunshine time with my two little boys, it may mean that I'm logging on later in the evening to finish off the work that I needed to get done. And from a threat actor perspective, being able to identify what is going to be legitimate traffic and what those expectations of your users are, those are things that are changing right now.
Yeah,
the
and
other
when we
thing
talked
is,
about, sorry, Mitch.
go ahead, Ivo.
So when you talked about BYOD, right? The definition of BYOD used to be very very simple, right? Where there were people who we allowed to bring their own device and install the controls onto it and use it. But when the pandemic hit, the definition of BYOD became very different, right? There were literally, home computers that were being used because people needed to start working the next day and they couldn't come into the office. So it definitely it's both a constant and a change, right? With that, the what.
Well, and a great example of this is your end users' home internet systems. Yeah. Effectively, those are now BYOD systems that are in scope for your organization. And if your end users are using outdated gear from a couple of years ago that have those vulnerabilities in the firmware that haven't been patched, that now may become an organizational concern for you, depending on how they're able to access the information that they need to do their jobs. So definitely an expanded asset class and some different risks that have to be considered.
Correct.
And that also applies to the different types of tools that your users need to be able to do their jobs. Whether that is sanctioned changes that have been made to allow video conferencing, to allow cloud-based services to be able to access these resources, or in some organizations, the case where the users have been permitted to be able to access their own solutions to be able to pivot quickly. And now getting to the point where you're having to have those challenging conversations about shadow IT and how to best understand your new threat surface. There's also been shifts in spending focus. We've seen a tremendous increase, particularly early on in organizations needing to provision resources for their end users, because they perhaps were using desktops in the office and now they're working from home. They need laptops and webcams and all of the software that you'd expect to see. And that is, very significantly changed the way that a lot of organizations have planned out their year. Some things have been pushed up to be able to meet new demands, and some things have been shifted. And I think those are important things for all of us to keep in mind in terms of what strategy looks like and how to best optimize the way that you are approaching these new security challenges?
Yeah, there's two policy areas really where we saw an extreme change in how organizations had to do their policies, right? Those that had shelved the how do we deal with work from home? Is this a problem that's top priority for me right now? The answer was no, right? A year ago, you would say no. Our work from home policy works fine. People work when they want to work, and our policy is still okay. To okay, well, this is the most important policy right now. And the other one is the physical access to paper and literally, the transfer of money using paper, the transfer of rights, and the signing, what we call the wet signatures on paper. That's all shifted quite a bit, and organizations had to make a quick change to be able to adapt to digital signatures and those pieces. And when you do that, you obviously increase your threat surface as well. Because you're taking away some physical human controls that were there with that human interaction of a physical communication as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've all heard stories of organizations falling for these business account compromises and having significant money transfers that were fraudulent because somebody sent up an invoice that was illegitimate. But this also is true of just changes in your security controls to be able to deal with these new changes as well. So just anytime you're introducing uncertainty to be able to address challenges in your environment, there's an opportunity for risk there. And so now is a great point to be reviewing what those changes are and having that risk calculation as an organization in terms of how likely are some of these going to be partially adopted or permanently adopted, and what changes do we need to make as an organization from a people, process, technology perspective to make sure that we're able to represent those changes in our environment. When I was a risk advisory consultant myself, it's that show me that you have the things in place, but also demonstrate that they're being carried out in operation. And so understanding and making sure that all of that realigns to what your organizational risk strategy looks like is really important. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the information that's specific to the prairies. And as Ivo mentioned, some of this is going to extend to other organizations as well.
Yeah, and I think the understanding of our market and understanding how it relates, how all these changes and how these things relate to us specifically, right? The Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta markets are mainly smaller, as we're talking about. I mean, there's some larger organizations within this market, but it doesn't compare to, for sure, it doesn't compare with the American market or even the Toronto market to some extent, where we're talking about some SMB markets. Smaller number of employees per organizations. We may be able, in some organizations are sending, if you have 20 people in the office, you can send, 5 in or even 10 into the office. So that's been a little bit of a change we've seen with some here, specifically with the lower numbers, the lower case numbers in some areas as well, especially when we're talking about, out of major urban centers. And SMB markets have a not just pluses or positives, but also a negative, which is you don't have the capital budget to invest in larger VPN solutions and larger and all the controls that need to be put in place. So that has put a lot of pressure in this market, and that's what we're seeing. A lot of pressure to meet the same level of business that we had previously with double the price when it comes to implementing controls. So it's important to focus specifically on the right controls and the right policies when you're implementing these kind of things. The slower cloud adoption is a common theme that we see across Canada. Canada's slower to the cloud adoption as compared to the U.S. market, but also specifically our region very much the laggard along with Eastern Canada when it comes to cloud adoption. And that, was a huge affected us hugely during the beginning of the pandemic, because we wanted to have this nimble, high growth situation where we're sending everybody home, except we had the limitation of our data centers and our VPN technologies and our pipelines within that. So that really affected differently here in the prairies because of that slower cloud adoption, and the ability to scale affected a lot of organizations where they had to come up with other ways, adding ISP connections, adding VPNs, replacing the firewall, and increasing the VPN capability of the environment. All that coming, as a side effect of that a slower cloud adoption. And then limited remote access. From an architecture perspective, there were areas in your network that you just didn't want to give remote access by design. And overcoming those limitations really became a struggle for organizations, because we always assumed there would be somebody in the office. So organizations have IT and even more so OT environments, like talking about essential services such as energy or telco, had to quickly make modifications, and not just logical network modifications, but sometimes even physical modifications to change that. So, I mean, this applies to everybody, but I think to some extent that we in the Manitoba Saskatchewan market, we're always assumed that we would have that butts and seats in the office kind of situation. So those are some of the ways that we've seen the differences here in the prairies market. But in the next slide, I'll if you can switch, Mitch, I'll talk to what are what have the successful organizations done. So what's interesting is you probably get a really um, as a as an architect communicating with clients across the country, you get a good smattering of people talking about the problems, but you also get the people who have done things really well. They really are loud and proud about what they've done, right? The first bullet really talks about the lucky ones, right? That had, for some reason, oversized their environments, had gone to a lot of SaaS, had gone to a lot of third-party services, and were able to handle that 70 to 100% remote workforce change, right? So some of them were the lucky ones that implemented this early. And then the other organizations that have been successful are the ones that have been nimble enough to adapt and modify their architecture quickly. That had a network team that knew exactly what to do and how to engage and how to replace hardware where necessary, or connect quickly with ISPs and increase bandwidth, and even in some cases migrate services to SaaS services where possible, or engage in that digital transformation that they've been talking about for years. So, and then there's also teams where data compliance work really closely with the IT teams and the security teams. When it came to sending people home, we were ready to send people home. We were ready to give them the laptops, but we weren't sure what it meant for them to access their data from home. So how communicating with your compliance team and understanding what do they have access to and how they can access this information from a new location is how successful organizations in doing this had a good view into that. But this doesn't mean that we're going to be okay in the next audit cycle too. So that's one of the things we want to highlight in the next slide, which is in that piece. So
one of my favorite examples early on from this, so an organization reached out to us and they had a pilot project that they'd been working on over Christmas to begin to establish their remote access capabilities. And they'd started with the IT team, but they had, they'd probably done the architecture, but they wanted to get that second look. And it's one of the few times that I've seen a penetration test with almost no results come back, which made me very happy, because the team had done what they had expected to do, but now they had to put it into production for most of their users. And it was a nice validation to be able to demonstrate to them that what they'd done was proper and correct, and that they were on the right path. So it's always good to see when that happens.
And then from in the next slide, what organizations prioritizing and what might be next, right? And Mitch, we talked a little bit about this, which is the change of everything to an identity-based focus, right? Addressing identity and password management, and role-based access. It was true before, and it couldn't be truer now, right?
Hmm. Yeah, and another area of focus, as you mentioned, is if users are not in the office, how does that change the way you deal with business continuity and disaster recovery? And how does that change the way that you would need to address a security incident? Uh, as organizations are slowly starting to come back to the office, that may be a different consideration now, but thinking about where we may have to return for a second wave, knowing what you may have to do remotely or as part of a distributed team is a consideration many organizations are needing to make. What you need to keep in mind in terms of moving to SaaS. Touching again on what we covered near the beginning in our own security study, that supply chain, whether it's a SaaS organization or another type of vendor, ensuring that they have the right configuration and security controls to meet your own needs is really important. It's even more important now when you're relying on their infrastructure and that shared responsibility model. But some of that is going to be another area of responsibility right now is making sure that those vulnerabilities that we spoke about earlier, that for those services that your end users need to be able to access things remotely, that they are secured, whether that is pushing patches, whether that's putting in compensating controls to make sure that you know that security edge is appropriately hardened.
Yeah.
Making sure that you have those criteria in place when you're making these vendor evaluations, looking at the access that those vendors may need to have. So Ivo's example about those on-premise environments that by design had been separated from the rest of your network. Those are often circumstances where you had vendors with certain access, and now's again a good time to review what that looks like, because I'm sure changes have happened on their side as well in terms of how they need to access those resources.
And the expanding software, the expanding software suites that you end up supporting because of the expansion in BYOD devices needs to be looked at as well, right? The Zoom was never under so much scrutiny until COVID hit, right? And all of a sudden they were the unvogue software to patch and to watch for vulnerabilities on. So there is going to be not just third-party access when we mean from a supply chain perspective, but also understanding that software is part of that as well, and that's where that vulnerability patch management comes into play, and also understanding solutions like CASB where that can help you filter out and understand what software is being used in your environment and what cloud services are used in your environment, because people will find a way to work, right? And sometimes the way they find to work is through bypassing your existing policies and controls.
A simple example that I saw from earlier this week is a new zero-day vulnerability in 7-zip. So I have 7-zip on my home computer because I really like it. I find it works really well, but I'm sure many, especially with BYOD devices where that may have not been immediately provisioned, or for organizations where that just isn't a priority for how you do business. But it's a critical security vulnerability that organizations need to take consideration of, and it may be one that would have slipped under the radar when you're looking at it when you're dealing with corporate resources.
Yeah.
Ivo also mentioned about what those changes to compliance look like. So physical access means something very different when we're talking about remote devices, and a lot of this is going to come down to what your organization's specific threat model looks like in terms of what availability of data exists on these endpoints. It's a very different circumstance if you're dealing with something like a Chromebook where there may not actually be data on the laptop itself, and everything is secured from an identity perspective, compared to users who may have to download data offline to be able to do their jobs. This was the case for me back when I was working in strategic security consulting work, where it was not safe for me to transport data over the internet, and so I needed to have physical access to it where I was working remotely. That's obviously a significant concern when you don't have those gates, guns, and guards that you have protecting your organization when users are working from home, or increasingly now with the changes in public health restrictions from other places outside the home. So coffee shops or other places of travel, those are considerations as well if that's new to your organization.
Yeah, you have very little control over that, right? And there's ways that organizations are finding to deal with that physical access, and some of them are even, having regular video calls to review. What's your situation at home? Do you have everything you need for work from an HR perspective? But also, are you following basic guidelines when it comes to safety of the information, right? Are you, making notes and leaving them clearly? Are you sitting in front of a window? Do you have 8 or 9 roommates hanging around? What's the situation like, right? So some organizations are, and obviously this is something that needs to be lined up with your threat model and your policies as well, to say, what is your HR policy in terms of privacy? What's your HR policy in terms of control of data within, the home, as being an extension of your office.
Mm-hmm. And also arming your end users with new information. If they are not used to working from home, they haven't had conversations about security awareness, about what's different when working outside of a corporate office. There's significant changes. Whether you're talking about cloud services, whether you're talking about just working outside of the corporate environment, or how to safely work with VPN and these sort of issues that, especially non-technical end users, it may be a struggle for them, and providing that new level of assurance that they understand what they need to do and know when to ask for help. If, for example, maybe they need a privacy screen, or maybe they need access to something so that they can securely store physical notes if that's a requirement. Those are something that if they know that is a concern for the business, they may be able to put their hand up and let you know, and give you an opportunity to help them.
Yeah, if your compliance and security team hasn't thought about those pieces, there's definitely a lot of work to do there. I'm assuming the next compliance cycle, your next audit cycle, should have those pieces as part of it. And as security professionals, you really need to put your hand up and say, I don't know what's happening out there, and I'm ready to to work with my audit team and my HR team to enable people to work securely from home. So, for sure.
Now we're getting into, so we got quite a good list of questions from people when they first signed up, but please take the time now, if you do have any burning questions that you want to follow up with, include them in the Q&A box so that we can run through them.
Should we discuss the poll numbers now, Mitch, or do you want to wait until
I think that's a good opportunity to do that.
Sure. There was a majority of you that didn't respond, so we're going to ignore that. It must be because you're not interested in giving out your information, but it's all good. So the majority of people thought that the numbers from Gartner were real, that they were 32%, over 16% thought that they were either nobody thought that they were pessimistic, but that they were either optimistic or realistic. So it's and it's just the times we're living in, right? We are so highly uncertain as to how things will go, but we expect, like you say, that a lot of it will be we will be continuing to work from home for a while. So you can see the result as well, Mitch.
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. Yeah, let's get into the Q&A.
Sure. So let's start. We spoke a little bit about what the second wave may look like from a business perspective, but from a supply chain perspective, this is a really interesting question. Part of it is I think it's going to be very dependent on what what level of change you needed to make with the last wave of what you needed. It may not be the case that you need a pile of laptops and webcams this time, but what are those changes that do need to be made for your organization? I hope this isn't the case, but looking at data from previous pandemics, the second wave of these tended to be stronger and longer. And so your approach to be able to look at what resources you may need help with, whether it's new infrastructure, whether it's tools for your end users, whether it's services support, or increased bandwidth even, those are considerations to make. And again, it's going to be very dependent on what your individual organization looks like. I know that we were very, very busy with helping organizations provision this the first time around. And I would imagine that if we return to that for organizations that didn't need to make these changes the first time, that's likely going to happen.
Yeah, I don't see, at least from the IT supply chain perspective, um, besides working from home, I don't know what else we could do. I think that there's organizations that need to shift how their selling model, right? The ones that have the ability to do so, or we're hoping who don't have the ability to do so. We're hoping that this wave would last 15 days or whatever the original conversation was. That it's lasted much longer than that, and organizations that need to make a change from a business perspective, though I think those are the ones that are going to start saying, you know what, this is the new normal. We need to spend money on driver side pickup systems, or we need to move our ordering system to the cloud to be able to scale with that piece. I think that there's going to be some changes from an IT perspective in that side for organizations that were betting that this was a short run. I think online grocery shopping is going to be a thing in the future, right? I think we're going to continue to do that, and any grocery shopping or malls or front end stores that don't have that capability right now, with that second wave, I think that's what's going to hit them and make them think more about that. So from an IT perspective, I think we're going to have a lot more systems to support. I don't think we're going to be shipping a lot more laptops.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that online commerce is a good example of an opportunity to think about what changes there are within your organization from a security perspective. So, as you mentioned, with just the simple invoicing and the fraud that's associated with that, same is true with online commerce, and organizations that are opening that up as a new facet of their selling model is something to consider how you want to approach that. Biggest risk to a company from their staff working from home. So
People.
I think, yeah, for sure. And I think that business account compromise, those fraudulent invoices, is a really good example, because it's a straight financial loss to your business, particularly with organizations working from home. Those opportunities for validation are harder. You can't walk down the hall and confirm with your CFO that that's what they expected of you.
I've seen a lot of high profile threats that have been thwarted by somebody picking up a phone or somebody
Mm-hmm.
walking to the office next to them, right? I think that as organizations, as much as we want to digitally transform, I think the old pick up the phone and have a human conversation with your CEO, about a big transfer of money or about a big piece before clicking on a link. I think those pieces are still going to be highly valuable and are going to continue to be valuable when it comes to defending. So the biggest risk is our disconnection, right? Our lack of human physical connection is going to continue to be a risk. And nothing, like whenever people ask me about what is the best control you can put in place, it's really the best, cheapest control is security awareness. Making users aware of what they should and shouldn't do. Should they add a printer? Should they not add a printer? Should they use all the Bluetooth devices they have in their house or not? Like all those classic sort of questions. And should they click or not click? So I think it's still that's the biggest threat from what I can tell.
Well, and it is slightly cliche to say that, but all these topics that we've covered today, that they really reflect the fact that we're speaking outside of the traditional infrastructure security edge that we normally talk about in conversations. And a lot of these issues do come back to identity and how you understand what is good behavior environment and what isn't. And that's very different when we're talking about a predominantly digital conversation.
Yeah. And I think that covers the third bullet pretty good, right? How do you predict that security in the workplace changing in the next 5 years? It's no longer about the network. It's no longer about the network card. It's no longer about the computer. It's about the identity. I'm an identity in my SaaS. I'm an identity that can be identified, and I'm an identity that can be, whatever I do can be managed and monitored by my organization, right?
one of the areas that was touched on in the security study, and I think is increasingly relevant now with the changes with COVID, is about changing the conversation from detection and response to resilience, and ensuring that as an organization you can quickly build back up from a security incident, and that the impact of that security incident is lessened, because we're no longer in a point where asking if we're going to get attacked, but it's what is the damage going to be, and what can we do to either mitigate it or quickly get past it. So some of those conversations in terms of the way your infrastructure, the way your services are changing, that's a piece to consider. Which kind of brings us to the next question about those solutions that you've had in a corporate environment that are really, really helpful to provide that telemetry and control to the IT team, whether we're talking about unified endpoint management or just the remote monitoring and management of those those assets in your environment. Those, there are assumptions in how those tools work and how they were architected in your environment. And this isn't saying anything, particularly bad about SCCM, but as a particular example, it doesn't really work well for non-domain joined devices. So if you're a predominantly Windows shop and you've moved to a remote circumstance, many of Microsoft services still require that constant heartbeat connection to Active Directory. And if you don't have that because users are not required to be in an always-on VPN circumstance, you may not have that visibility that you had before. So there's considerations that you need to make to ensure that the data that you have are accurate, and also that they're providing you the most painless way to do what you were doing before, to ensure that you can still push those patches, to make sure that versions are up to date, and that your actual infrastructure is working the way that it's expected.
And when you do make a move to that SaaS manage, and I know we're down to 4 minutes, so we got a couple more questions. When you do move to that SaaS model, remember that the administrative interface, the centralized interface for managing all this stuff is the most important piece for you to secure, right? You have to remember that putting MFA and your centralized management. I mean, Twitter taught us a lesson in the last couple of days, right? Which I guess it was a week ago, where administrative interfaces have to be guarded more than anything else in your side. So let's eat our own dog food here as well as administrators, and set those places. When you talk about centralized administration, I think it's a point worth mentioning there as well. So.
Well, and I had one of our F5 subject matter experts was having a conversation with him about that BigIP vulnerability from a couple of weeks ago, and he made a very, very good point on this, because it was more of a concern to me than him. But he mentioned that admin console should never be exposed to the internet, and so organizations that are dealing with that as a challenge, that there's architectural conversations to have about that. And increasingly, while we're looking at what we need to expose for users to do their job, but to do it securely, those are the sorts of conversations that we need to be having.
Yeah, but we see a lot of pivoting attacks too, right? So that management network, not just internal, but also in its own, with its own logical controls around it, firewall controls, and multi-factor authentication for that management network, super important, because we know that attackers know about these vulnerabilities, if not the same time, way before we know about them, right? So.
As I mentioned in our introduction, my day job in part is to design the testing programs when we have penetration testing engagements, and I like to make the job of my penetration testers as hard as possible. So those opportunities to logically separate and add additional compensating controls for those admin consoles takes you a long way towards doing that.
All right, Mitch, we got 2 minutes, 1 minute, 2 questions. Changing passwords.
Okay.
That's a good one.
Yes, and it's talking about security awareness. There's been recent changes that NIST and others have put out in terms of helping users more effectively protect their accounts by having longer, stronger passwords that they have to rotate less frequently, and applying other controls like multi-factor authentication to do that. I'm a huge fan of enabling users to use passphrases and put them in a password vault that they have access to. So when they need to rotate them, they can. And when there's an indication of compromise of the business to some degree, it's very quick for them to rotate them. So I'd encourage those of you who are not familiar with that to take a look, because I think it's a good win from the security department to be able to make it easier for your users to log into the things they need to do their job.
We could spend a whole hour on password best practices and systems that will allow you or not allow you to use them. So, um, uh, what about the last question in terms of physical security requirements, policies and procedures around that?
I think now is a good time to map out, if you haven't done it already, what the services are that your users need to do their job, and make sure that there are controls in place for what they had in the corporate office and what they have working in a distributed environment. So talking particularly before about, what are those physical access controls on your endpoints? That may be a laptop lock, that may be your lockout policy, that may be a privacy screen, that may be a policy that says you have to have a clean desk even though you're working from home. And that's going to be dependent on what your particular threat model is, what your organization looks like. But this is a good opportunity to review that and make sure that your policy aligns and your controls align with what your users actually need to do their jobs.
Yeah, another thing I would say is whether you're forced to follow a compliance framework or not, I think it's always a good idea to look to them. If you fancy yourself as a technical security guy, take a day a week, put on a different hat, and look at what you should be doing from a compliance perspective. It's going to make a huge, it's going to put you together with the other organizations. It's going to make a huge difference on what you do from a security side. If you can flip, if you can put on that compliance hat for a little bit. We're at 3:01. I think it's been awesome talking to you, Mitch. Regardless of whether people are listening or not, I think this is a good conversation for us to have, and it's been great, having you guys participate and listen in. I look forward to your feedback and your emails about today, and we can definitely continue many of these conversations on on a different medium as well. We can also continue to have these in the future if people want them. But it's been great talking.